or would it look like, because we haven't had one for a while. But the third thing that I wanted to share was just remind everyone there's lemonade in the back. There's a sign-in sheet if you want to make sure you get updates from the Boulder County Progressive Coalition, which is a sponsor of this event. And Boulder County Progressive Coalition is just about not quite a year old, but we've been kind of doing events like this, and we're committed to advancing really nonpartisan, progressive democratic politics in Boulder County and around the state, both advancing progressive issues and real democracy, small d democracy, which requires discussions about issues. So that's my contribution. Remember, there's lemonade. Someone's supposed to be coming with fresh baked cookies, but they're not here yet.
There's no cookie. There's no baking.
So, who wants to go first on what would a progressive attorney general look like?
Well, I can jump into that.
And I just want to make clear, the goal is to not get into the how do we get one elected part. And there are other candidates that I think are going to be announcing today and next month. We just want to be clear about so that we all know when we're deciding who to vote for and who to support, what our goal is, which is kind of electing what will a progressive attorney general look like if we're able to work hard enough and get one elected.
We've had, in my view, one progressive attorney general in the history of Colorado, really progressive, and that's a guy named J.D. McFarland. J.D. McFarland, who's still around, is a terrific guy. He was elected, he ran, I believe, 3 times before he got elected. He defeated an incumbent Republican named Duke Dunbar, who had been Attorney General for something like 30 years before J.D. beat him. J.D. was very, he had a legislative background. He had been a district attorney in Pueblo. He'd also been a state senator and state representative from Pueblo. Very clear on his vision for the office. Excellent manager. If you want to know some of the history of J.D. McFarland, read Jean Dubofsky's book. Jean Dubofsky was one of the first deputy attorney generals that he hired, and she helped him reorganize that office. To have a progressive attorney general, you first of all have to have a really, really top-notch lawyer. The litigation the attorney general's office does is very complex. You need somebody who's politically attuned, but you also need somebody that understands complex litigation, understands the federal courts, and understands how to initiate and win tough litigation. Secondly, you have to have somebody who is very committed in their progressive principles, articulates those, and is willing to listen and to debate those issues. Thirdly, I think you have to have somebody who shares my view, which is the law in whatever position for public lawyers is a tool to protect the vulnerable in our society, to make our community more fair, to make our state more fair. You have to have an attorney general who understands that and is committed to that and knows how to use the law to make the community more fair. And finally, you have to have an attorney general that can work with and can lead and can inspire law enforcement, because law enforcement needs to be led, and it needs to be led by people who they trust and understand. And we've certainly seen this in Boulder County, that if you can convince law enforcement that progressive principles are important, you can really make a difference. But that's what I think is needed. I think a lot of the basic areas, and I know Joe shares many of these views with me, consumer protection is absolutely critical. We have jurisdiction as DAs. The Attorney General has the same jurisdiction statewide. There's so much that can be done to use the law to educate the most marginalized in our society and then to protect them when they become victims. Oh, sorry.
We'll move back and forth for you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that during this conversation, you're going to hear an awful lot of, yeah, I agree with Stan, and maybe he'll agree with me too, because I don't think that he and I are too far off from our ideological points of view. And I think that he's right that J.D. McFarland was the progressive attorney general of his time. But what does that mean for 2017, 2018? We need something much different than what the politics were for J.D. McFarland way back when. What we need is we need a street fighter. We need someone who's gonna stand up to this federal administration and lead the effort, and not just sit back and wait for other states to do things. We see Washington and Hawaii and New York leading in so many different areas against this administration, and Colorado does nothing. And of course, we have a Republican Attorney General who, championed his win during the inaugural balls. And so, we shouldn't expect that she's gonna do anything like that. We shouldn't expect that she's actually gonna fight for our environment. But that's what it means, I believe, to be a progressive Attorney General in this day and age. You have to take on this administration. You have to take on oil and gas. I'm telling you, if this whole idea on suing a county on behalf of a multi-billion-dollar industry is just, it's repulsive to me. And I think that the next Attorney General who comes in, hopefully a Democrat, won't tolerate any of that stuff, and instead will start going after the polluters themselves, because we haven't had an Attorney General in such a long time willing to go after the industry. And where I kind of differ from Stan, I agree with him in some ways, but I differ a little bit, is when it comes to law enforcement and the DAs.
Here come the cookies.
I want to be very clear about this. Everyone says the Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the state. Well, the Attorney General is also the people's lawyer. And that means that the Attorney General needs to hold DAs and law enforcement accountable when they are not obeying the law, or when they are fudging the law, or bending the law. And that's the difference. And I'll tell you, as being the Vice Chair of Judiciary for this past year, and sitting on Judiciary for the past 5 years, law enforcement and DAs don't like being told what to do. They have an enormous amount of power, and we see how they use their power here in the state of Colorado. And I have to say, by and large, we have really good law enforcement, and we have some pretty good DAs, and I think that you have the very best DA here in the state of Colorado in Stan Garnett. But I've seen the real bad ones too. And they've come in front of my committee bringing bill after bill after bill that Stan won't come and testify on in favor of, because they're that bad, where they try to get more and more power to be able to use that power against people. And I have killed more bills in the Judiciary Committee because I see what they're trying to do. As an Attorney General, you need someone who can see the forest despite the trees, and understand that you have to hold DAs and law enforcement accountable as well. And that's a really tricky balance, trying to partner with them, but yet letting them know that there are certain lines that you're just not willing to cross. And I think that I've provided some very bright lines for the Attorney Generals and, for the Attorney General and the DAs, as well as law enforcement in my legislative career. And they know that there's just some things that they're just not gonna cross with me. So yeah, there's some partnership there, but partnership means too that they have to respect that office.
Okay, so anyone wants to be on the list to make a comment or ask a question, great. I'm gonna take the privilege of the first topic that I've got. Daryl, Alex, and what's your name? What? Janine, okay. And then Tom. So my question is, what if anything can an attorney general, we've all talked about, you both talked about, kind of protecting the vulnerable and victims. What if anything can an attorney general do statewide to help the level of protection for victims of domestic violence and child sexual abuse? Is that totally outside of the scope of the AG, or what can you do?
No, it's not. Although the AG in Colorado is a very complicated position, and it's very different from a district attorney position. One of the major functions of the Attorney General's office, which I think, and Joe, you may know, now I think it's about 450 lawyers, isn't it? Is to represent state agencies in all kinds of disputes. But there's definitely a role for the Attorney General to take in leading the discussion around domestic violence and sex assault and sex abuse of children. And one of the most critical things, and it's great to see Veronica here from SPAN, you know, one of the most critical components of fighting domestic violence and sex assault is to have the appropriate conversation publicly about that. It's one of the things we've tried to do in Boulder County a lot, and it's one of the things that the current Attorney General has not done much of. There's been some background issues there, but it's a matter, I think, leading the conversation, helping people understand these issues and the dynamics behind domestic violence and sex assault, why the laws are the way they are, how we can improve them legislatively, and then also making sure that there's a voice for victims. Because one of the things that's traditionally happened in the justice system in the United States is that defendants by and large have terrific representation. Colorado has one of the best public defender's offices in the country. Fine lawyers, they're very well funded. Victims have no specific voice in the system, particularly victims of domestic violence or people who are extremely marginalized and whose plight and situation is often hard to understand. So as much as anything, what the Attorney General can do is lead the fight for that, lead the discussion for that, and help to raise consciousness about that.
Yeah, pretty much it's about influencing policy. You know, we see the Attorney General's office engage when it comes to human trafficking issues. They're there to testify on human trafficking, and they're always there for those particular issues, but not so much for domestic violence. Here's a good example. Back in 2014, I believe it was, we had a bill come through the Judiciary Committee that said that if a person was convicted of domestic violence, then their gun would be removed from their person. They wouldn't be allowed to have a gun. You didn't see the district or the Attorney General's office weigh in on that. In fact, they stayed far away from it. And I think that on that kind of issue, the Attorney General's office needs to be in there, influencing the policy, making sure that domestic violence victims and survivors are very much have the ear of the Attorney General, just as much as sexual assault victims. On all those bills, the Attorney General should be in there, helping lead, helping craft that policy to best protect Coloradans.
I just want to put you on the list, Rafi, but I know Boulder and Denver and the big counties have big units, I mean, with specialized lawyers, but don't the smaller rural counties need actual trial lawyers? I mean, isn't that something the AG can do if they're not doing, is have a unit that will, you know, be able to actually send a lawyer to help prosecute if a rural county needs it? I mean, isn't that part of what we can do?
Yeah, I think that's an option, Alan. I also think huge problem in DA's offices is funding, particularly in rural areas. They're horribly underfunded, can't keep up with the public defender's office. I think the Attorney General should be advocating more for funding for district attorneys. Domestic violence cases are fought on the local level by the local district attorneys. Many of our large districts have only 2 or 3 lawyers in the entire districts for huge geographical areas. Many of the public defenders in the same area are staffed with 7 or 8 lawyers, so it's very tough. Domestic violence is a specialty. You need to have lawyers that understand those issues. The AG can either help with training, help with staffing, or help be an advocate for funding.
Yeah, I was in Morgan County just yesterday. I gave a speech out in Morgan County and learned that there were 4 judges covering 7 different counties. I was astonished by that, and the number of district attorneys, well, there's one district attorney covers, I believe, I think it was 7 counties.
Yeah, there's Brittany Luton is the elected DA out there. I think she has 3 deputies for 7 counties.
Right, yeah, and I was astounded by that too. I mean, it's pretty tragic, the lack of resources that are out in the rural areas. And I agree that I think that we have boosted DA pay and deputy DA, assistant DA's pay over these past 5 years to try to have a draw out into those areas. But what's really interesting about district attorney pay is that some of it comes from the state, but some of it comes from the county too, right? I mean, you see the Denver DA is the most well-paid public official in the state of Colorado, right? And there's a balance. They get part of the money from the state and then a whole lot
We
of
actually
money
get
from
very
the
little money
county.
from, we get almost no money from the state. It's all funded by counties, yeah.
You do? You hardly get any?
The state sets the minimum salary.
Yeah, we get a minimum salary as elected, but yeah, but the point's exactly right, which
Right.
is,
Yeah.
so in other words, if you're from Denver County or Boulder County or Pitkin County, you're funded okay. If you're from Huerfano County, Las Animas County, you know, the different poor counties where maybe there's no tax base and maybe 1,500 residents, Saguache County, the DA's office is struggling. It's an issue that we've been trying to figure out a right balance on, and the Judiciary Committee and others in the legislature have helped us some, but there's a lot more to do.
Yeah, there's a lot more to go in terms of supporting the rural areas, and we have to. We have supported the Public Defender's Office quite a bit by providing pay raises, pay increases, and we thought that it would be, you know, only just and fair to do the same with the district attorney's offices throughout the state. But you know, we still have a long ways to go, and we're in a, as you very well know, we're in a budget crunch, and so trying to find that additional funding to help support those outlying districts is very difficult.
But and I think to just stress the point, prosecution of domestic violence cases is a specialty. You can't just grab a lawyer off the street and have them go handle those cases well. It takes a long time to learn the dynamics, the issues the victims are going through, the control dynamics with the offenders. So we need specialties there. Yeah.
Okay, Darrell and Alex and Tom.
Yeah, Darren O'Connor,
Darren,
I'm
sorry.
really grateful for you both giving your time on a Sunday. And I know, as a preface to my two questions, one is I want to say that, you know, Joe, you mentioned that the front line is your first home, and I know Representative Salazar from a recent, for example, recently being at the airport where there was a rally against blocking President Trump's announcement or proclamation that people from 7 different countries couldn't come in, and Representative Salazar, you were there standing up for the people's rights and protecting the people from being arrested at the time. That I share that because one of my questions is, you know, I think there's a bit too close of a relationship between a lot of district attorneys' offices and the police, and I saw you really balance that out in a case that came up subsequently, because you expressed in court when you were testifying a close or friendly relationship with Commander Lopez, who was sort of a defendant in that case, while at the same time you stood up for First Amendment, which I think really shows your commitment to both relationship and rule of law. So maybe you could expand on that, and DA Garnett, you're welcome to share your position on police relationships. And for you, I would share a concern that too often our police get away with, are protected under color of law. And is there any way to I don't know, make the people a little more safe with regard to police shootings? We've had several in the past couple of years here that you've handled. And the second piece is, as Attorney General, you might be forced, if say Denver Homeless Out Loud brought a case against the state, you might be forced, I think, as AG to defend that. And what would that look like for you? I'm just very curious.
Well, let's go to the first part of it. Yeah, I didn't hesitate to go out to DIA to support the people rallying there against the Trump administration's first executive order, very much an unconstitutional executive order. And I went out there because, number one, I believed in the effort to protest and to rally at DIA. But number two, I felt that there might be a situation where the police might get involved, and I wanted to be there as number one, an observer, and number two, to help out where I could. And so when I arrived, it was very much peaceful. I mean, the whole time was very peaceful. People were actually handing out roses, and we were singing and saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and people held some very artful signs and with colorful language, and it was just a lot of fun. And then the police showed up, and you know, I wouldn't say that they showed up in force, but they were around the area. And I saw Commander Lopez, and we knew that a permit had been submitted that afternoon, and it had not been approved as of yet. And when I spoke with the officials at DIA, they said, we have a 7-day turnaround time. And I said, that's ridiculous. You need to have a reasonable alternative. You know, and these people have a First Amendment right to be here. You know, what are you going to do? And why don't you have an expedited process? And it's because I know constitutional law very well. I mean, I sue cities and the state on constitutional grounds all the time, and I know the First Amendment. And that's when Commander Lopez came up to me and said that, you know, people were gonna be arrested. I got him to back down, and at that point, Councilman Paul Lopez was working with the city and county of Denver. I hopped on the phone with the mayor's chief of staff and said, you know, these people are here peacefully. You don't have an expedited process. You don't have any reasonable alternatives. This is not gonna turn out well for you. And it was through that negotiation that we got everybody to back down and the city to do the right thing. And then subsequently they were sued because of the fact that there were no reasonable alternatives that were provided or an expedited process. And they asked me to come and testify in court, so I did. And you know, I advised the court, you know, what my role was in making sure that the peace was preserved amongst everybody, but also really questioning why they didn't have an expedited process. And sure enough, the judge struck down the way that the city and county of Denver does things because they didn't have an expedited process, which is a reasonable alternative that's required under the First Amendment. And I was happy to do that. And as Attorney General, guess what? I'm still gonna go to rallies. I'm still gonna go to the protests, right? Because that's the right thing to do. I mean, just because you're an elected official doesn't give you the right and doesn't immunize you from being there with the people. I've always believed that. Before I became an elected official, as a civil rights attorney, as a community organizer, I was always there to be there with the people because that's the right thing to do. That's how democracy works. And so, yeah, so there's a little bit of an explanation. So that's the your first question.
Let me try to really articulate, Darren, my view of the importance of police-prosecutor relations. And also I warned Alan, I wasn't totally sure I was gonna be able to make this because my brother's in town and I'm taking care of him, and I have to leave at 5 to 5, and I apologize for that, but I'm easy to find if any of you wanna track me down with questions afterwards. You know, when I became district attorney, there was no district in the entire state, probably in the entire country, that had worse relations between the prosecutor and the district attorney and the police than my district. 30 years of an administration that did not focus on good relations, plus the John Benet Ramsey case and the Thane Smicka case, had completely broken down relations between the police and the DA. I knew that was a problem when I took over, and I made it the top priority. I meet monthly with all my police chiefs. The command staff have peer relationships with each of my chief deputies. I want to make sure that we work very closely with them, mainly because I want to make sure that we can influence how they're doing their job, and we can also hear from them about how we're doing our job. Now, we have, I think, developed really good relations, and I would invite any of you who wanted to come and watch one of our monthly police chiefs meetings. To stuff that we sort out, very frankly, is very open, and I think is very healthy. That has not kept me from being quite demanding of the police. In my almost 9 years, we've prosecuted, I think, 32 police officers from various departments for everything from DUI to domestic violence to a number of sexual crimes to the elk case, of course, which is sui generis, as lawyers say. But corruption is a top priority. And any kind of issue of police misconduct has to be pursued very aggressively by the DA. However, we have not filed murder charges on any of the fatal shootings that we've had. That's partly because the law that's been adopted by the legislature is very favorable to police. And our issue in reviewing every case is, can we prove a case under the law of Colorado? And I have not felt in the 17 cases I've reviewed that we could prove a criminal case against them in those situations. Doesn't mean we haven't had frank discussions, doesn't mean we haven't reviewed policy, but that's how I approach the issue. Now, key thing about police need leadership. They need priorities set. They need people saying, this is what we're gonna focus on. And let me give you a great example. Many of you know that for the last almost 6 years, we've had an immigrant protection initiative out of my office. Now, this is quite a controversial issue. I've probably gotten more death threats over this initiative than anything else, and I get death threats pretty regularly in this job, which I'm sure Joe does too, we all get them. But certainly as DA of Boulder County, you attract attention. This has attracted attention from around the country. Many, many people are opposed to it. Now, last week, some of you know, last Sunday, we had an event at the Dairy Center where I got almost every one of the police chiefs to participate in the process of reading the stories of immigrants as part of this effort to identify, to relate, to connect. I was able to do that because we have good, strong relationships, and I've got a leadership role with them, and I'm helping them to adopt the priorities that we're establishing. So the DA or the Attorney General has to have a frank, trusting, and leadership relationship with law enforcement. If it's either totally broken, as it was when I started out, or if it's totally hostile, you can't provide the leadership that you need to.
Second part of your question was about homeless, and where would I stand in terms of the state being sued on behalf of the homeless population? And I don't see that happening because the state doesn't have any laws that adversely affect the homeless population. It's the municipalities through their through their local control that have adopted those kinds of criminalization of the homeless. But you have to ask yourself the question, and I've been asking myself this question a lot. How can the Office of the Attorney General, in support of those human rights, how can the Office of the Attorney General turn around and sue those municipalities to stop the criminalization of the homeless? How can the Office of the Attorney General sit down with the ACLU and figure that one out? So I'm not looking at it through the opposite end where, well, what happens if the state gets sued, because I don't think that would happen. I'm looking at it through the other spectrum on, once I become Attorney General, how can I stop that behavior? Because ultimately, once again, as I opened up my speech, the Attorney General is the people's lawyer. The people include the homeless. And what could I do in my position to fight for their rights?
Let me ask you both, because I think this is an important issue. Is the AG an independent actor? I mean, so if someone is suing the state, does the Attorney General have to defend the state if he thinks the state's policy is unconstitutional or wrong? Or can the Attorney General make a unilateral decision? No, we're not going to defend that, that law because it's wrong.
The AG has an obligation to defend Colorado statute in court. The most classic example was Governor Romer, who defended Amendment 2 against the challenge brought by Gene Dubosky.
Yeah, and let's also remember too that the Attorney General operates under ethical rules too, and so the ethical rules require you to defend your client, but also that if the attorney knows that a particular law is unconstitutional, that attorney needs to notify the court of that belief. But let's remember that every single state statute that's enacted is presumed to be constitutional. So the Attorney General's office does have to fight for those laws.
Alex, you're next.
So I had some campaign questions and policy questions. You want to stick kind of to the policy stuff for this talk?
Please.
Okay. For oil and gas, so at the State Oil and Gas Commission right now, Cynthia Kaufman is suing Boulder County for the moratorium that was in place for 4 years, and I think that moratorium has since expired. Is that correct? Like, where do you guys come down on local control versus state control for oil and gas? I think the advantage of state control is you get a lot of counties out there who wouldn't have regulations, and it kind of raises the bar for them. But the problem with state control is you have counties like Boulder County who want to have more stringent oil and gas regulations who can't do it because apparently the Oil and Gas Commission's rules preempt local control. So I just want to know where you guys come down on local versus state control.
Alex, I'm a huge supporter of local control. As a matter of fact, that's where I think Joe and I differ on this issue of the homelessness. The bill that he was running in the legislature, I thought, took away local control on a very complex issue. My view is if you give most localities the freedom to figure out problems, they'll do it in a way that's fair and that's appropriate. The absolute best example, and I was just back giving a speech on this in Washington, D.C., is marijuana. The marijuana system in Colorado is working for a lot of reasons. One of the most important is that we gave local governments control, complete control, to ban it totally if they chose, or to regulate it however they see fit. I think if you did that with oil and gas, you would see, there would, there would be some counties that completely banned oil and gas, but if you gave counties the power, like they've got with marijuana, many of those that used to ban it are now accepting it, but with very stringent regulations, you would see, I think, a very meaningful and locally based regulatory system develop.
Well, to be clear about that, on marijuana, counties can't ban the consumption.
No, but they can ban the sale,
Right.
which is the issue. Yeah.
Okay. But so, well, in terms of local control, is we didn't let we didn't give the local towns and counties the right to decide whether or not individuals could consume it in their homes.
True, true.
And for my part, I believe in local control too, up to a point. When it becomes a statewide issue, what a locality is doing, like with the issue of criminalizing the homeless, that becomes a statewide issue, and then that falls under our purview. There's well-established case law on that, where you have these localities who act just in such a manner that it affects the rest of the state, that we as a state can come in and say no more. And that's how I feel about this criminalization, these ordinances that criminalize the homeless. But at the same time, that's just a slight pulling back on local control. Where we say, hey, look, you're adopting these ordinances to push the homeless population into other areas because you don't want them in your municipality. We're just gonna peel back a little bit on that. We still believe in local control, but that's one area where I believe that, we do need to peel back. And on the issue of oil and gas, I think that there needs to be absolute local control on this. I come from a district that's being fracked right now, or soon will be. They're gonna be fracking underneath a high school that I have in my district, under a middle school, under one of the lakes under my district. And because of forced pooling, they can do this. And I have constituents who are just, absolutely afraid and really concerned about what's happening just on the other side of the road from them. And so I do believe that both counties and municipalities should have the right to decide if they want to have fracking activities within their jurisdictions. Now here's the constitutional rub, is that you have the issue of the surface rights owners, and then you have the issue of the mineral right owners, right? And so in that great balance there, that's where we have to really become creative. And as a legislature, we have to become creative and say, you know what? You cannot forsake the rights of the surface rights owners in favor of the mineral rights owners. And so how do we give that local control to the counties and the municipalities where they can balance it out themselves? And so this is probably one of the issues of our time here in the state of Colorado. And I've moved forward with very heavy legislation to address those issues, and being supportive of Mike Foote here in Lafayette, and supporting him as well, because we have to balance it out.
Alex, let me add one other thing when I talk. I really think if there was local control, that most counties would figure out ways to permit some level of oil and gas development that they were comfortable with. Let me tell you, let me kind of put a fine point on this. The Weld County District Attorney's Office handles fewer cases than I do. They have fewer trials than I do. And they have a budget that's almost $2 million a year greater than mine because of the royalties and the severance taxes that Weld County gets from oil and gas development. Now, I don't regret that here. We're limping along, we're getting the job done. But there's a lot we could do to protect victims of all kinds of violence if we had that extra money. If you gave counties local control so they can make decisions, like again, has happened with marijuana, you can decide, here's how we want it to approach, there would be a strong financial incentive for them to figure that out.
Tom, and then the one person.
I was next.
Okay.